keynote speech, we somehow failed to give her a proper introduction. It was my mistake, Ajahn Catherine. And I also apologize Ajahn Yukti, who is her student, whom I asked to give an introduction to Ajahn Catherine. But somehow it didn't work out that way. So I'm sorry. I have an honor to introduce the keynote speaker, who is the second one of our conference. In fact, he doesn't need that much introduction. But I have known Professor Michael Herzfeld, the keynote speaker this morning, since late 1990s, when he started to learn Thai language and Thai culture. Unlike other Thai scholars whom I have known, Professor Herzfeld doesn't belong to what we often call the Cornell Southeast Asian program, nor the SOAS Andrew Turton lineage. He come from different school. Before he received his doctorate in social anthropology from University of Oxford in 1976, he was trained as an undergraduate in archaeology and anthropology at the University of Cambridge, and modern Greek studies from the University of Birmingham, where he also awarded a Doctor of Literature for a series of seminal works on modern Greece. He joined Harvard, the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University since 1991. Interesting, his first trip to Thailand in 1997, at the invitation of his oldest friend, Ajahn Pritisan Chumpon, might have been both ad hoc and rapturous, as he called it. And when he returned, then his return to Harvard, to the mentorship of his late Stanley J. Tambaya in Thai and Southeast Asian studies. Ajahn Tambaya and the linguist Ajahn Norwanit helped not only in galvanizing his interest in Thailand, but building his confidence in pursuing a new field site in an entirely different context. Professor Herzfeld is known among Thai scholars, friends, and colleagues simply as Ajahn Herzfeld, who can speak Thai well and very fond of spicy food, as I also know him. He has been coming back to Thailand for more than 2 decades to study Thailand because of his deep commitment to the defense of social justice. Too many of us with whom he has shared his prediction for himself early in his career, that he would never become an activist, never make ethnographic films, and never work outside Greece. Thailand has posed a challenge to all of these predictions. In Thailand, Ajahn Michael Herzfeld has been actively involved in speaking out on behalf of the citizens whose rights have been undermined, making his arguments provocative outside and beyond the domain of pure academic discourse, and promoting global awareness of Thailand through his work as the founder and the founding director of Harvard University Asia Center Thai Study Program. Ajahn Michael Herzfeld reminds me of Clifford Geertz, who have taken comparative view of Indonesia and Morocco, but he himself also interested in Greece and Thailand. So his comparative perspective comes from his many years of working in Greece and Italy. His most recent book, he gave me a copy this morning. Thank you, Ajahn Herzfeld. Siege of the Spirit, Community and Polity in Bangkok, published last year by U of Chicago. In this book, Ajahn Herzfeld presents a 2-decade-long culmination of his anthropological study of a small community of 300 residents in the heart of old Bangkok, who for more than a quarter of a century have been resisting the authorities' demands to vacate their homes, seen by them as inappropriate to be located in such a symbolic site. Arguing for the importance of activism in his scholarship, Ajahn Herzfeld described a story of a continuing battle in this small community for their livelihood against the authorities' broadly defined claim for the common good through eviction. With this book, Ajahn Michael Herzfeld presents a true and heartfelt ethnography of hope, community leadership, and collective action in defending this right and survival. And I have to confess that for this reason, I am the one who invited Professor Herzfeld to be the keynote speaker for this conference. The activism or activist scholarship or engaged anthropology also is something which I myself share. I have worked with the local communities in northern Thailand and northeastern Thailand, defending their right for their livelihood, either in the case of dam construction or forest conservation. Just to mention briefly before I invite him to give a keynote speech, his recent research includes projects on the social and political impacts of historic conservation and gentrification, the social effects of urban policy, the discourses and practices of crypto-colonialism, social poetics, dynamics of nationalism and bureaucracy, and the ethnography of knowledge among artisans and intellectuals. Ajahn Herzfeld is still with Harvard University, but he also shares his knowledge and scholarship by serve as distinguished visiting scholars at various institutions. For example, at Leiden University, Melbourne University, or University of Melbourne, and also in China, particularly in Shanghai University. So he is well connected internationally, and more important than that, I think his heart is near Pom Prakan in Bangkok. So thank you for coming to the Thai State Conference and deliver the second keynote speech. And please welcome Professor Michael Herzfeld.
Do I have something for the PowerPoint? For the PowerPoint?
Now we know it's really an academic conference.
For those of you who will use PowerPoint in your presentation, please drop your PowerPoint in the counter outside the room so that they can transfer it to each room. But somehow this morning there must be some misunderstanding, so I apologize for that. But second, there is a evaluation form which is put on your desk. Please, if you don't mind, please fill up the survey questionnaire that being left over there. Okay. While waiting for Ajahn Herzfeld.
It's been my own fault, but it's probably my best qualification to be an academic. I would like to take this opportunity, while we're waiting for the first slide, to thank the organizers and to say how very moved I am to see some of the people here, including Ajahn Chayan and several others, who were really instrumental when I began to become interested in working in Thailand. And it's great to see them all here and to have that sense of fellowship and support that made it possible to make a big jump of that kind. I am going to read my paper, which is something I'm not actually accustomed to doing, but for reasons that I think will become very clear to all of you as the talk proceeds. It is a great honor to be invited to be a keynote speaker at this conference, an honor that, given that some of our colleagues are unable to be present, also imposes a deep responsibility to suggest what we lose through their absence. I hope I will be able at least to imply how grievous the damage is to Thai studies on the international level, even when some may disagree with certain of the ideas of those whose absence we do so deeply deplore. Disagreement, after all, is the source of new knowledge and understanding. I feel deeply the responsibility that goes with this honor, which is to speak my mind about such deliberate deformations of our intellectual world, deformations that will resound through history as yet another of those exercises in mind control that, as history teaches us, have always, in the end, failed ignominiously. I hope that at our next gathering, whether in Thailand or abroad, all of those whose absent presences I mention will reappear as the vibrant, clangorous, challenging voices that we know them to be, and that as true knowledge requires. There's another more personal reason or concern that weighs somewhat on my mind. That is not the right slide, so we should, I think that was just there. That was also part of an accident. Let me see. Catherine had the same problem, I know. Which way do we point? Catherine, I'm sorry that, go to the second slide. Can I just signal to you? Go like that? Okay, next slide. This has nothing to do with, no, something's gone badly wrong. Okay, I'm going to have to do without the slides. Let's not worry about it, okay? And I apologize. I had a nice slide of a dictator of Greece by the name of George Papadopoulos, and the fact that somebody with a name who's begin with P seemed very appropriate. He was wearing a brown uniform, and the resemblance with somebody very familiar to all of you, I think, is quite striking, but we'll pass on that. Anyway, as I was saying, there's another more personal concern that weighs somewhat on my mind. I'm deeply conscious of the fact that I entered the Thai studies field at a relatively late career stage, and in my 50s, and that many in my audience today can lay claim to far greater expertise in this arena than I will ever possess. This year is the 20th anniversary, as Ajahn Chayan already mentioned, of my first visit to Thailand, and also the year of my 70th birthday. My first aerial interest in my own scholarly field of anthropology was, as you heard, modern Greece, an interest that began from my school days and that I continue to cultivate with ongoing research. And it has been as a Greek specialist that I've mainly gained such reputation as I may have acquired among my disciplinary peers. But that background, paradoxically, may serve as a surprisingly strong qualification for me to speak to you today, and in the spirit that I've outlined. To understand why we should look at the state of modern Greek studies in the 1970s, it exhibits some striking parallels with Thai studies today. There was then a growing, if small coterie of scholars interested in the history, literature, language, and social and cultural conditions of that small country at the extreme southeastern tip of the Balkan Peninsula, suffering under the jackboot of a remarkably intolerant, opinionated, and misguided military junta. They developed impressive erudition that sometimes occasioned surprise, so small and apparently unimportant was Greece in the grand scheme of things. That was permissible as long as they did not offend the sexual prudery and political narrow-mindedness of the colonels. What they did not do, however, was develop much knowledge of neighboring countries, despite the crucial role of the Ottoman Empire in the formation of modern Greece and of the Turkish Republic in its ongoing evolution. Few modern Greek specialists knew a word of Turkish. Most did not even know Italian, another language influential in the country's cultural genesis. As for Bulgarian, Albanian, and the rest, those seemed to be exclusively the preserve of linguists, and frankly, not many people came to hear their papers. It was only after the collapse of the military junta of 1967 to 1974 and the consequent amputation of the dead hand of a deeply suspicious censorship office, and even more once the high tide of nationalism began to ebb around 1993, that a more open-minded and deliberatively comparative perspective began to emerge, sometimes against lingering resistance. If someone had suggested a conference on globalized Greece in those days, the reaction would have been a hollow laugh. Despite tourism, despite extensive American military and other aid, and despite an impressively far-flung diaspora, Greece was isolated by a military regime that tried to regulate every aspect of daily life, from skirts to religious worship, exhibited no sense of humor, and was hostile to many of its neighbors. The scholarly study, I often think, by the way, that we should create a department of Southeastern Studies and not name the continent. The scholarly study of modern and even of ancient Greek culture, many of its best exponents either censored or unwilling to lend any legitimacy to a regime that had little understanding of culture, languished in the deep shadow of an idealized past, and suffered from the prudery and religious fanaticism of the national leadership. Many topics could not even be touched, and certainly there was not enough there to ensure a useful basis for comparison with other cultural worlds. The state of Greek studies, in other words, reproduced the condition of the country as a whole. The parallels with Thai studies today are striking, although this gathering begins to show that perhaps change is underway. Few scholars of Thailand have the competence to work across the national borders, although a few do master minority languages or those of neighboring countries. Still fewer attempt comparisons that would entail professional knowledge of more distant places. Again, there are one or two exceptions. In fairness and with respect, I still feel that my knowledge of Thailand is nowhere near the standard many of them have set. My area of greater expertise, after so many years, remains Greece. But the effort to reach a comparable standard in a second region gives comparison an embodied and immediate nature, and perhaps lends some force to my present point. Thailand is intellectually treated as an isolate in a manner that recalls the increasingly restrictive state of political quarantine. And in this, it very much resembles the Greece of 4.5 decades ago. Moreover, talk of globalization, which is very common in Thailand, does nothing to alleviate that isolation. On the contrary, it shows that the critical and international perspective by which many scholars understand the concept of globalization is preempted by a consumerist version that discourages active thought. Part of Thailand's scholarly self-isolation is, to be sure, a practical issue. The enviable depth of detailed knowledge possessed by many specialists in Thai studies, especially those who are themselves Thai or living in the country, comes at a price. Human energies and lives are finite, and the choice of depth as against breadth, while not one of absolute mutual exclusion, does mean that individuals will follow their personal inclinations, which is something they're perfectly entitled to do. Thai scholars are also limited by scarce financial resources, sometimes by poor libraries, and a punishing university leave policy that does not allow enough time for pure field research, especially in my own discipline of anthropology. Moreover, official historiography, as Ajahn Thongchai has pointed out, convinces some of those studying abroad that foreigners have nothing to teach them. The plea of having been grievously misunderstood is as much an excuse for refusing new insight as culture can be an excuse for refusing the possibility of change. It is no coincidence that both the Greek regime of 1967 to 74 and the present government in Thailand have both used medical metaphors to justify their interventions in the body politic, and both have also used the female body, the twerking teenager is a recent example you'll all be familiar with, to advance their metaphorical engagement of the body politic in a more general sense. The point of my address today is not to dictate the form of future scholarship to my Thai colleagues, even if one could imagine that I had the authority or sheer cheek to do so. It is precisely because good scholarship is incompatible with restrictions on what scholars can study or what they can do with that knowledge, with, in a word, the official management of scholarly production, that I refuse the temptation to say what my friends, Thai and other scholars, should do with their time. That is a game that rightly leads to resentment and refusal. To return briefly to the parallel between scholarship and politics, it reproduces what Benjamin Zawacki, in a new book documenting Thailand's political tilt away from the US and toward China, shows to be a source of great resentment among Thai politicians dealing with the condescending and sometimes downright insulting instructions meted out to them by their so-called American allies. Lecturing one's politico-military allies and one's academic colleagues alike can have disastrous consequences, and Thai scholars have every right to be annoyed by some foreign colleagues' tendency to do just that. In this respect, academia and geopolitics mirror each other, just as each is mirrored in such anecdotally recalled moments of irritation. remaining immured in a self-isolating island of esoteric knowledge, however profound, is a personal choice, and it should be respected. Nevertheless, I also think it's fair to say that it doesn't advance critical understanding as much as a more robust comparativism would. The irritation of which I've just spoken deserves our attention because it suggests a realistic basis for my claim, the underexplored synergy between politics and scholarship. The self-isolation of a country that doesn't allow free-ranging discussion of potentially sensitive issues, and we hope but do not yet know that this conference will substantively allay that fear and reduce its grounds, is mirrored in the self-isolation of a national area studies tradition that refuses to acknowledge that comparisons with superficially very different places might actually be useful. I dare to say this, not again because I have any right whatsoever to tell my Thai colleagues that they should be more critical in their approaches, but because those who have tried to be so have found their voices silenced, and because comparison is a productive form of critical discourse that itself has some problems that stimulate critical thinking. Greek scholars, during a period of military rule, experienced many of the same restrictions that their Thai counterparts experience today, including a long list of excluded topics and opinions, most of which were collectively condemned as communist or as unseemly. It begins to sound very familiar, does it not? As in the Greek equivalent to Mairebroi, undermining the very basis of the bourgeois code of respectability. Those restrictions had precisely the opposite effect of what was intended, with the result that today, despite conditions of economic hardship, Greek academic life hosts lively debate and constantly informs the operations of a rambunctiously healthy body politic. I would argue, in fact, that Greece is probably the most democratic country in Europe at this time. Certainly, it would have been unquestionably inspiring to have a text like Catherine Bowie's Rituals of National Loyalty in Greece during the early 1970s. But the Greeks were already generating their own text, and by using fiction and poetry to push back against the stultifying effects of officially sanctioned historiography and ethnology, they worked their way around the literalism and legalism of the military regime. Legally prohibited from publishing any books whose titles did not reflect the contents, one poet and 17 prose writers produced a collective volume appropriately titled, in order to meet the requirements of this absurd law, 18 texts. And government officials could do nothing about it without making themselves look even more ridiculous, because after all, the authors had followed the law. This was a work of fiction rather than of ethnography, and most of the texts were about imaginary South American dictatorships where leaders claimed that they were like doctors operating on a sick body politic, precisely the metaphor that I've already mentioned. And what is particularly interesting about this volume for our present project is that its fictional setting in another continent made it implicitly comparative, and the implications were hard to ignore. But the colonels clearly understood that they couldn't actually challenge the book's publication without turning a mere suggestion of similarity into a hard certainty, which would have defeated what they understood as their strategic purpose. So they left it well known, and that, from a tactical point of view, turned out to be an equally bad mistake. The book is credited with being one of those things that, in the vague and indecipherable ways that characterize such processes, arguably changed a political culture and ushered in a radical new era of both politics and scholarship. Comparison is neither unproblematic nor uncontroversial as a method. It is important to recognize that comparison is necessarily an imperfect art. It does not provide definitive answers and can only suggest directions for new inquiry, but such inquiry is what a narrow vision would prefer to shut down, saving up disaster and ignorance for the years ahead. Let us constantly remind ourselves that comparison is always imperfect, that is its strength, and that on occasion, as the great British anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard is said to have remarked, it may even be impossible. But there is much to be gained in the effort to achieve such an impossible goal. And Oscar Wilde actually, I think, once said, I try to imagine 6 impossible things to do before breakfast. It's almost breakfast time. Greeks sometimes seem to resent comparison with an Asian society. a sadly racist attitude that reveals their dependence on their ideological role as the living ancestors of the European ideal. Thais, on the other hand, are surprised that one would compare their country with one that's about the ninth the size of Thailand, current population 11 million, thereby revealing a conceptual focus on scale that overlooks the fact that both countries have undergone ravaging economic crises for intriguingly related reasons. Even as some deny the relevance of comparison, in so doing they highlight its importance, an importance, in short, that is clarified by every attempt to shut it down. Indeed, every such attempt at silencing is, ladies and gentlemen, a sign of weakness. Secure power can always live with the truth. The absurdity of censorship practices under the Greek military regime was a key factor in its downfall, precisely because it helped to reveal the regime's hollowness. Of course, we should not overstate such comparisons. Comparison is always imperfect and ultimately, some believe, impossible. As I've chosen to work in both countries, in Thailand as well as in Greece, where I've just come from conducting new fieldwork, I have found myself unavoidably exercising a comparative perspective, if only to explain the occasionally uncanny sense of familiarity that keeps returning to haunt me, and that I encountered when I began coming here to Thailand and thinking about topics for research. I have lived for several years in Greece. In particular, I lived under the military regime and saw how its miserable excuses for intervention in every area of social life were simply designed to protect its grip on power, and in the name of preserving pure Hellenic culture from the allegedly foreign threat of communism, particularly to prevent the poorer and more disenfranchised segments of the population from gaining access to the resources to which they had increasingly felt entitled. Think now of the reasons that motivated so many people in Thailand to come from Isan and move to Bangkok. It was the time, now celebrated in a prominent art exhibition in Athens and briefly discussed by me in a 2002 article on crypto-colonialism, when the students of the Athens Polytechnic University, emboldened by the news from Thammasat University, were defying the tanks, holding up slogans, one of which said, "Apopse thayini Thailandi," tonight will be Thailand. This is a specific historical link between events in the two countries, but it also enables a comparison between two countries with different trajectories to the present and between events separated by several decades. Greece today, for all its economic woes, is, as I say, one of the most robust democracies in Europe, perhaps the most so, and has clearly escaped from the cycle of coups and counter-coups of yesteryear. After the last Thai coup, one Greek newspaper sadly remarked, "Again and again and again." That was about Thailand, not about Greece itself. Of course, no two situations are ever exactly alike. Comparison is always imperfect, and on occasion it may even seem to be impossible. But still, I respect the highly specialized work of area studies for the painstaking acquisition of skills that focused area work entails, and have drawn from it and conducted some myself in both Thailand and Greece. But at the same time, when we focus narrowly on areal concerns, we lose a great deal, because in so doing, we treat our object of study as a geographical, historical, cultural, and yes, political isolate, when, in a word, we act as though it had no relevance for anyone else, and as though it therefore had no reason to listen to external critique. In so doing, we may also be guilty of reproducing and reinforcing a collective inferiority complex, something that, as we'll see, is a mark of that beholden condition that I call crypto-colonialism, and that in the academic world takes the form of an attitude that, by definition, foreigners have nothing to teach local scholars. And not only scholars, the distance between scholars and officials may sometimes be closer than either side wants to believe. As Ajahn Chayan mentioned, my main research in Thailand until recently has been with the tiny Pommahakan community in the Ratanakosin island of Old Bangkok. Earlier this year, I attended a meeting there with community leaders, representatives of the Kotomo and of the military, and architects from the Siam Architects Association. Having requested the privilege of speaking and being granted it, I managed to say a few things about the illogic of ignoring foreign observers' views in a situation in which the Kotomo wishes, among other things, to develop the site as a space for tourism and as a recreational facility. At this point, however, beautifully beautifully instantiating exactly what I was complaining about. The deputy governor of Bangkok reached out for my hand in an apparently polite and conciliatory gesture that was immediately understood instead as a tactical instrument of extreme rudeness, since he used it to cut me off and begin speaking himself instead. Thai observers were shocked, which was probably why the next day I was invited to give an interview with Matichon. My point then is not that Thais were collectively uninterested in hearing what this foreigner had to say. Quite to the contrary, the Matichon piece was a full-page spread. But my views were certainly inconvenient for those who were already firmly determined to proceed with a policy that had also come in for some remarkably trenchant Thai criticism, not all of it from academic sources. There are important reasons for which it is easier to dismiss or ignore foreign observers' commentary, but those reasons are not at all an indication of political strength. Quite the opposite. Once again, defensiveness is a sign of weakness, of the deeply felt need to conceal the collective and mutual inside knowledge that I call cultural intimacy. And it seems, perhaps for good reasons, to be markedly more noticeable in the crypto colonies than anywhere else. This perhaps explains why, despite their professed contempt for eggheads, political leaders of authoritarian stamp react viscerally to anything that looks like intellectual critique. This can be as true of democratically elected politicians as of dictators. Recall especially, for example, Thaksin's derisive attacks on Tirayut Bunmi, otherwise known as the man in the pullover. You may not remember, but Thaksin made a lot of fun of his dress style. Elected authoritarian figures must also face their electors, and this at least tempers such displays of defensiveness, although I have to admit that Donald Trump doesn't seem to have realized that yet. In any case, anything that looks like national studies carries many sources of potential friction over what may or should be discussed. Even the definition of Thai studies, rather like that of modern Greek studies, is a central issue. At least in Thai studies, we don't have to deal with the problem of the word modern. We don't have to make sure that everybody realizes that we're talking about a modern living population. But the problems don't stop there. Here's another part of it, briefly mentioned by Ajahn Chayan yesterday. Why should a nation-state be the defining core of an area studies field? The nation-state as we know it today is a rather recent and Eurocentric invention. Reducing our field to the lineaments of this highly successful but also very parochial concept makes us guilty of what, again I refer to Ajahn Chayan's address, what Wimmer and Glick-Schiller have called methodological nationalism. That is, of assuming that it is indeed the nation as defined by a bureaucratic state that should determine the contours of what we do. Here too, the painful emergence of nation-statehood under crypto-colonial conditions is a common theme. Some will object that comparison is always imperfect, and in such cases as this, it may even be impossible. But that is not a reason to avoid attempting it. There is much to learn, even from failure. And I will say parenthetically that every graduate student of mine is told when you go into the field, you will learn most from your mistakes. In the Thai studies context, the nation-state focus is particularly ill-suited to a long-term view of Siamese history. Long before Rama V radically changed the form and structure of the Siamese polity to accommodate the demands of the Western powers and entered into the terms of reference required by their civilizational discourse, the Siamese people, speakers of predominantly Thai, but also other languages, lived in a polity whose conceptual form, as Tambaya pointed out, was predicated on the segmentary image of the mandala. This is inherently recognized by all scholars in our field, to be sure, but it does also mean that the way in which cognate language groups are understood is still overdetermined by the framework of national boundaries. Of course, the powers that be do not want to return to the segmentary proclivities of the Mern, any more than the European leaders are willing to contemplate the segmentary proclivities of regionalist movements at home, or even of the rebellious tendencies we know as Brexit and Grexit. Their recalcitrance, however, offers us all the more reason for trying also to get outside the bureaucratic pratet framework in our analyses. That framework is especially inappropriate for the study of minority groups, whether within Thailand's borders or in Yunnan, Myanmar, or Vietnam. They too, and perhaps more vigorously, seem to embrace the model of the Mern. And as Hjörleifur Jönsson has so vigorously argued in his most recent book about the Mian people, they have not been chased up into the mountains in order to die out there, whatever James Scott and others may think. Indeed, I would argue that those who have demonstrated against the current austerity regimes in Athens and elsewhere in southern Europe share some significant ground, both with their ideological foes in Thailand, notably the yellow shirts, and with urban protesters around the world, including the red shirts. Of course, such comparisons are outrageous when we first contemplate them. Of course, they are imperfect, and perhaps in the end, they will prove impossible. And, to sound a Shakespearean note, Brutus is an honorable man. But that's not a reason to avoid giving them a serious try, or, so to speak, to avoid criticizing Brutus with an indirection as appropriate to Thai cultural and political sensibilities today as it was for rather different reasons to Shakespeare's audience in 17th century England. The idea of a state-defined national culture is rarely challenged even by those who might want to argue about what the cultural stuff, to use Frederick Barth's felicitously relevant phrase, it contains. Greeks talk about Hellenism, Thais about Quampentai, and so on. And for Greeks and Thais alike, most of the imagery is cited even by those who challenge the authority of the state, and it comes from the state's own rhetoric. The idea that Thai culture might not be defined by something national, as represented by state authorities, seems so counterintuitive, so contrary to common sense, that it behooves us to recall Antonio Gramsci's definition of common sense as conceptual hegemony. Surely, this is the key to any putative explanation of why, as Tongchai noted, it's so hard to get Thai students abroad to pay serious attention to alternative visions of Thai's social, political, and cultural history. In the same way, modern Greek studies had to struggle hard to escape the clammy hand of the irredentist so-called great idea, the idea that every land where Greek was spoken belonged by right to the Greek nation state. Thai scholarship contends with strikingly similar blind spots, including the vision of a greater Thai-speaking world that should come together as Pinong with the national Thais, needless to say, playing the role of the elder siblings. Ask any Lao about this and you'll get a revealingly irritated or irritable response. Or take the position of the Sino-Thai communities within Thailand. Luang Wichit Watakan's famous characterization of the Chinese as the Jews of Southeast Asia is usually understood as telling us something interesting about the position of the Chinese in Thai society, and indeed it does tell us about that. But it also tells us about something much more fundamental, which is how Thais had come to understand what it meant to be Thai, that a biogenetic model of descent through blood lay forever in wait for any minority with the temerity to carve out a successful niche within the nation state. This biogenetic model, incidentally, also helps to explain why Greeks so often used to tell Greek-speaking foreigners, and they would say this to me very often, that Greek is too hard for a foreigner to learn. And I would say, well, what about? And they always found some way around it. While even today, Thais often simply assume that someone with Farang features could not possibly be speaking Thai at all. Minorities do not fare well in contexts defined by such a conflation of biology with culture. Ironically, it was the creation of modern nation states led by bourgeois elites that first intensified the persecutions of the two minorities in question, the Jews in much of Europe and the Chinese in Southeast Asia, but then also provided the enabling conditions for their emancipation and full participation, sometimes, of course, to revert to catastrophe again, as in Germany in the one case and Indonesia in the other. Commentators from Anderson to Zawacki have decentered the Thai ethnic argument by highlighting the dynamic, cosmopolitan, and transnational role of the Chinese in politics and economics. And if we start to think about the irredentist proselytization pursued overseas by China on the one hand and Israel on the other, the point becomes even more instructive. If scholars won't decenter the nation state, perhaps in time the politicians will do it for them. But whereas the politicians, caught in the logic of their own nationalist aspirations, apparently cannot see that their irredentist wiles undermine the very idea of the homogeneous ethnic state, Scholars do have the intellectual equipment to contemplate the consequences of thus decentering an entity whose centrality we have too often and too intensely been taught to take for granted. The marginalization of minorities is usually a feature of crypto-colonial states precisely because of these states' needs to establish at least the appearance of cultural homogeneity. While in Greece, where until the economic crisis began to bite hard in 2009, no one really picked up on the idea of crypto-colonialism, critical voices in Thai studies, notably that of Thongchai Winichakun, were already using it in the Thai form Ananikom Amprang. In Greece, however, the concept has now acquired real purchase as a democratic society examines critically and freely what has happened to it in the recent past, how it has escaped the iron rule of the colonels and their Cold War predecessors, and why it is nevertheless still struggling with the imperialistic designs of the most powerful European Union states, notably Germany. In particular, Greeks are examining the role of foreign-dominated politicians who have arguably exercised much more power than the German and Danish princelings who occupied the throne of Greece and who simply served as a conduit for some of that foreign pressure. In maintaining the sclerotic grip of an artificial official language and of a nationalistic ideology that put Greece perpetually at odds with its neighbors, effectively fighting a proxy war for its Western protectors, until one conservative and pro-Western politician, Konstantinos Karamanlis, an old Cold Warrior, came to his senses after several years in exile in Paris, and given the opportunity afforded him by the fall of the colonel's regime, he was invited by them to come back and save the country. He channeled the country rapidly back to democracy and toward the republican governance for which the entire electorate voted. Here, indeed, comparison brings out differences rather than similarities. For example, whereas the Thai monarchy is an indigenous institution and widely respected as such, let us be very clear about that, even though it was necessarily responsive to Western pressure, especially from the reign of Rama V on, the Greek monarchy was foreign imposed, a German princeling favored by the British and the French, and consequently viewed with understandable suspicion by significant segments of the population. And as the story I've just told rather suggests, there are other differences too, differences that have certainly produced radically contrasted contexts for scholarship today. But these differences are intrinsically interesting and serve to remind us that indeed comparison is always imperfect and on occasion may even seem to be impossible. Such an inquiry may push us productively, nevertheless, beyond the self-censorship that inhibits good scholarship and contributes to the isolation of our scholarly endeavors, the isolation that afflicts both what we do as scholars and in the places where we do it. For example, it is interesting that almost all the countries that could be described as crypto-colonial have gone through at least one lengthy phase of such authoritarian governance. At the same time, the differences are also important. The point of a comparative approach is emphatically not to shut down analysis by suggesting explicitly or otherwise that all the cases are in some sense identical, the same. That makes no sense, and it's the antithesis of critical inquiry. Comparison is by its very nature heuristic. Its flaws, rather like the solecisms accidentally committed by the novice ethnographer trying to explore a new cultural terrain, can be especially productive of new thoughts and insights. Thailand has never had to bear Greece's burden of being considered the cultural ancestor of an entire civilization, Europe, and at the same time, its deeply flawed descendant. That story was conducted by German scholars and instrumentalized by the Western powers, notably France and Britain, as a way of controlling a country that was largely created in order to build a cordon sanitaire between the West and the rest. But there are similarities nonetheless. In particular, I want to signal similarities in three areas: ethnic conflation, the hijacking of historic conservation, and what Eli Elinov has recently called the weaponizing of urban space, and that I've described as spatial cleansing, with a deliberate goal of evoking the parallel of ethnic cleansing. And with that, of course, the deployment of bourgeois models of respectability as a means not only of beautifying cities, but also of forcing citizens to conform to certain standards of appearance. These are all interconnected and all have to do with concepts of cultural and ethnic purity, concepts that perhaps explain the fascination with Thai-speaking minorities. The one important difference, for again, comparison is always imperfect and often borders on the impossible, is that such processes have encountered critical resistance in Greece. In Thailand, despite grassroots efforts, resistance to these processes has been largely silenced, though I would argue that simply means that for the moment it has gone underground, as Claudio Sopranzetti has argued in his forthcoming book on red shirt dynamics in Bangkok. What is interesting in a comparative framework about the emergence of the concept of Kwanpen-Tai is that its claim to uniqueness seems to be contradicted by its association with distinctively Western, not to say Victorian, notions of respectability. Notions that not only regulate what is considered acceptable dress, as in the notorious code promulgated during the Pibun years, and Catherine Bowie showed that illustration to you yesterday, but what is also an acceptable form of urban design. These two things are also connected with models of civilization that owe a great deal to the predominantly Western-derived models brought together under the general label of what I once called the global hierarchy of value. So their very claim to uniqueness is paradoxically also a recognition that their sameness is of the same foreign inspiration. This is also the paradox of the national museums that you see all over the world. The claim to uniqueness, in other words, is not, so to speak, unique to Thailand or anywhere else. I do nevertheless think it is fair to say that it takes an especially acute form in countries that can easily be characterized as crypto-colonial, probably because those countries have a need to say, we were never colonized, we are unique, but then have to deal with the consequences of the similarities of the conditions in which they were allowed to claim not to have been colonized. Just a few days ago, I encountered in the Greek village where I was conducting fieldwork an elderly man who assured me that Greece had given the world its only civilization. How did he know that? Our teachers told us that at school. One sees here the institutional and rhetorical power of nationalist narratives. The example nicely recalls Tongchai's description of the impact of schooling on Thai students' reactions to foreign scholarship about Thailand. Moreover, the comment of a local bystander points to an even more interesting aspect of the encounter. This man argued that Greeks had been taught that they had produced the world's sole civilization as a device to unite the once fragile country in the face of massive external pressures. Doubtless the claim to uniqueness expressed in this example is exceptionally strong, but I think that differences notwithstanding, and we must again remember that comparison is always imperfect and sometimes impossible, it points up beautifully the unease that is expressed in all such claims. That unease is palpable and has a distinct and distinctive logic. If we are not unique, we have no ultimate claim on national identity. If we are unique, we might not be recognizable as a nation by others with the power to decide. The only resort, it seems, is to imitate the uniqueness claims of more powerful nations, and it is no coincidence that the Thai term Siwilai is obviously French or English in its etymological origin, at a time when Siam was threatened by British or French invasion. Or consider the use of military-style uniforms of obviously Western inspiration, apparently on the if you can't beat them, join them principle. The use of uniforms for many areas of life that in most countries today demand only civilian dress, including student dress at university, suggests a regimentation of the body politic in quasi-military terms that harmonizes with and beneath the image of the monarch whose own military dress announces his role of supreme commander, not only of the armed forces, but of all those others who wear uniforms recognized as following a national standard. Where Thailand differs from the Greece of today, but not from that of the period of Colonel's rule, is the penetration of everyday life by an expansion of this concept of uniformization. Uniforms serve a dual purpose. They're respectable and they're a form of discipline. Furthermore, in Thailand, they're also a mark of being Siwilai. But there are other ways of marking the body in what look like entirely nationalistic ways that may nonetheless permit a measure of resistance to specific dictates of the central government. For example, I'm going to cut this a little short because we're running out of time, but the recent fashion that you see very commonly now, especially I've noticed in Bangkok, of wearing the so-called Siamese top knot and otherwise affecting a more traditional Thai dress may in some cases be the result of a more strongly nationalistic environment, but it also sometimes allows some resistance to that model. Thus, for example, the residents of Pom Mahakam, most of whom were passionate royalists and many of whom supported the yellow shirts in the pre-2014 protests, are nevertheless locked in what may now be a doomed struggle with the authorities over their right to remain. Some years ago, when a film crew showed up and asked them to be extras for a historical drama, they dressed up in period costumes of the mid-19th century, and many of them continued to wear those costumes. But this was a way of saying, we are actually better Thais than the people in the Kotomo. And this was one of a number of devices that they used to get that message across. They also, for example, were very polite in their use of language. The community leader in particular had a marvelous rhetoric. His use of the Y is very significant because when he is being respectful, he is very respectful. But when he's dealing with police and he's trying to wrest authority from their hands, or with the Taunati of the Kotomo, he will just go very quickly like that, and it's understood that he doesn't really care a damn. So I think these are significant shifts. And again, I'm summarizing part of this paper because we are running out of time, but I want to say that there are many examples, for example, among the Democrat Party politicians described by Mark Askew, let's say 15, 20 years ago, whose performance of the Naklang role was a very effective way of, as it were, conveying a kind of cultural intimacy to which nobody could really admit in any formal discourse. Again, I think maybe Donald Trump was watching them, but there is this appeal, in other words, to an aspect of national culture that is not accepted by the state authorities, but is certainly recognized by everybody as something we all know about and don't particularly want outsiders to see. That's, by the way, one reason why anthropologists are not very popular with governments. And again, I mean, there were parallels with Greece. One very prominent Greek politician who actually became prime minister in the end hung out with people in the part of Crete where I was doing my research. He dressed up like a Cretan shepherd, although his clothes were a lot cleaner than theirs because he wasn't actually working with the sheep. And when they started firing guns in his presence, they were doing something that is technically illegal, but because he was there, it was considered okay. And so those particular shepherds and that particular politician not only got away with it, but the politician actually benefited from it. Greek politicians adopted Western dress and dismissed most of the traditional costumes as either hopelessly outdated or, as in a few cases, Turkish. This adulation of European dress will be familiar to Thai studies specialists. They were taught, notably under Pibun, to treat Western dress as the model of modest respectability and civilization. This has also been the idiom of the modern Greek elite since its emergence in the early 19th century. The comparison I'm suggesting here, however, suggests another interesting point, which is that values that have long been treated as traditionally Greek, especially regarding gender relations and power differentials, have turned out in recent historical research to be actually of rather Western European origin and to have Victorian rather than local roots. In Thailand, the 19th century and several decades thereafter saw an almost surreptitious decline in female power, notably with regard to inheritance, as Tamara Luz has pointed out. And in her work, again, we see very clearly that what is now presented as traditional Thai ideas about gender roles actually may very well be of imported origin. And one could go on at some length. Also, for example, the treatment of sexuality more generally, where certainly the efforts of serious scholars like Peter Jackson and Naropan Dangwiset have substantially contributed, and also the research that a young colleague, Jutaton Prawatiyakun, on the sexual politics of Kathoey identity in Europe, helped to move this study now outside the nation-state framework that had so long restricted it. And, you know, when Thai people also tell you, well, Thailand is very tolerant and we put up with, you know, we accept a great deal of deviance from the heterosexual norms, that's a little bit like Europeans who say, I'm not a racist, but. And I think that these patterns are surprisingly rooted in, and should be traced historically, because they have roots in very much the colonial relationship with the larger world. So to conclude, you should remember that Thailand did not have to bear the weight of a German-invented vision of its ancestry to the European ideal, a problem that even led the colonels, who were notoriously poorly educated, to ban certain ancient Greek works of literature on the grounds that they were sexually too explicit. For the colonels, it seems, Aristophanes was much raunchier than any twerker, so some of his writings had to be removed from the official cultural genealogy. So once again, difference here is as revealing as similarity. Comparison is imperfect. So I draw this keynote speech to a close with grateful thanks for your patience. I worried, frankly, about the difficulty of saying so much about a cultural world so far removed from that of the Thai-speaking world as is the world of the Greeks. But I know I can rely on this audience's now rather urgent need for a straightforward consideration of the consequences of regimented ignorance on the future, not only of the country, but of all the people on whose lives it continues to have a deep impact. And you can only really get out of that restrictive focus by engaging in some form of comparison, at least implicitly. I hope that the comparisons I've sketched here will prompt productive discussion, including healthy disagreement about all such pressing issues, and that attempts to silence those critical voices will be recognized as the signs of weakness that, as I have said, such attempts usually are, always are. The example of Greece, amidst all of its admitted economic difficulties, and Thailand, by the way, is hardly lacking in economic difficulties, offers some hope. I therefore offer these sallies into comparison with the deepest respect for the sensibilities of all who care about Thailand and its future. I believe that self-critical, open-minded comparison offers a way out of conceptual and thus also ultimately out of political isolation. In this, scholars can truly set an example to others. But please remember, as we must, comparison is always imperfect, and on occasion it may even seem to be impossible. Yes, we must remember that. But remember, too, that Mark Antony called Brutus an honorable man. So are they all, said he, all honorable men. And after nearly an hour of listening to this address, perhaps you will agree that comparison with Greece can show us, or you may feel that comparison with Greece can show us nothing revealing about Thailand today. But frankly, I doubt it. I really, really doubt it. I feel that such comparison can prompt us to think about precisely those things that others would like us not to think about at all. Thank you for your kind attention.
Can I get your attention? Just a few announcements about the lunch, because we will all separate into different panels. The lunch, for those who are having special preference for food, like halal, vegetarian, will be downstairs, at this floor. And for others, it's upstairs for the lunch. And also for the reminding of those who are presenting today, you have to drop your files at the presentation drop-off just on your right hand outside.